Blood flowed across the chapel floor, and her voice was no longer a voice. He choked, gurgled, and growled. The courtiers turned away in shame. She screamed, but only a hoarse gurgle escaped her throat. Beneath her chin was a gaping hole, black, uneven, gnawed away. The priest was speechless, and the queen continued to tear at her tongue. According to reports by the royal physician Jacques d'Ossel, which were sent to the archives of the Royal Hospital of Saint-Agathe, on the 16th day after the onset of gangrenous inflammation of the lower jaw, the patient lost the ability to speak, eat, and recognize faces. A phase of aggressive self-harm began. She tried to sink her teeth into her own chin, tore the skin off her neck with her fingernails, and then began to chew on her tongue. The text is accompanied by a note, not to be published during Her Highness's lifetime, to be destroyed upon confirmation of death. The illness itself began imperceptibly. In the spring of 1482, Queen Françoise de Valois disappeared from public view. She was 58 years old, the chronicles of the time note, her thick, pale appearance, trembling hands, and swelling in the ear and throat, attributing it all to a cold. Only those close to her knew. Decay had begun under her skin. First came pain when chewing, then a foul odor from her mouth. When a tumor in her lower jaw burst open and pus mixed with bone fragments gushed out, doctors diagnosed syphilitic bone damage, complicated by internal abscesses and infection from decayed teeth. The court surgeon André Pitot performed 2 bloodletting procedures, opening the veins in her forearms and draining up to 700 grams of blood. Her temperature did not drop. Then they applied ointments based on goat fat, arsenic, and boiled knotweed. But instead of relief, tremors began. The queen's fingers went numb. Her pupils did not react to light, and she began to lose consciousness briefly. She would not allow bandages to be applied, tore off the bandages, and muttered about rot that had to be burned out. By the beginning of May, the entire royal court knew that Her Highness was dying, but the illness was not publicly acknowledged. In documents, she was listed as indisposed. Ambassadors from Naples and Arras, who had arrived for negotiations, were allowed only to see the king and his advisors. Only Louise's sister, 3 nuns, and 2 guards were allowed near Françoise's chambers. Doctors were replaced every 3 days. They could not stand the stench and sleepless nights. Françoise's chamber became a hotbed of superstition. "It smells inhuman there," wrote the brother of the court apothecary in a letter to the court. Servants refused to take out the chamber pots at night until they were promised double pay and communion. A film of mucus appeared on the walls, and the curtains in the room were constantly damp. One report from a former guard states, "At night, she mumbles melodiously. The words are foreign. They do not sound like French." The symptoms worsened. The inflammation turned into necrosis. The lower jaw, deprived of blood supply, began to disintegrate. One by one, her teeth fell out. Then a piece of bone broke off under her chin. Doctors tried to stop the decay by burning part of the tissue with a red-hot iron, then applying poultices of vinegar and church wine. It helped for 2 days. Then the second wave of pain began. A record from Sister Guillemette, who cared for the queen, reads, "When the bandages were removed, I saw a mouth, a cavity, but not a whole face. It was as if the lower jaw was empty. All that remained was a hole, and something was moving inside. I thought it was worms, but it was her tongue. She was trying to speak, and her tongue was writhing, but there were no words." It later emerged that the queen had begun to gnaw at it from the inside at night, so that she would not hear the voices. During the same period, court intrigues intensified. Prince Jean, François' eldest son, sought the immediate transfer of all powers to himself. His opponent, the king's brother Charles, claimed that the queen's illness was punishment for her ties to heretics. On his denunciation, 2 former doctors and 1 of the nuns were arrested. All 3 disappeared in the dungeons of the Toulouse prison. Rumors circulated that one of them was a eunuch sent by the Protestants who allegedly secretly smeared the queen's cheeks with poison. No traces were found. The day when Françoise's face finally decomposed is recorded in the report of the chaplain de Ramon. The next morning, the bandages were removed from Her Majesty. The skin under her chin slid off in a flap, exposing the mucous membrane. Her lower lip was missing. The remains of her tongue were gray and rotten. She looked at us imploringly, but could not cry. Her eyes were dry. Her pupils did not move. The court advisors demanded that the queen's condition be hidden from the people. Complete isolation was imposed. All visits were prohibited. Doctors were ordered to report only in writing, through the castle messengers. The king did not approach his wife's chambers. Rumors circulated that her body was already dead, but her will was strong and would not let her soul leave. In the second half of May, seizures began. Uncontrollable moaning, banging her head against the wall, bleeding from her nose and ears. Her hands had to be tied. Her body became emaciated. Descriptions of her skin condition testify to this. Pale gray, covered with blisters, sticking together in folds, flaking at the slightest touch. The word curse was uttered for the first time. It was then, in early June, that Françoise tried to tear out what was left of her tongue. Under the influence of opium, she fell into a stupor, woke up delirious, and began to scratch her face. When she was found, the bed was soaked with blood. 2 basins of tissue and teeth were carried out. Her mouth was eaten down to the bone. A nun lost consciousness while trying to give her water. At the beginning of the second week of June, the guard was doubled. Not only outsiders were banned, but also some of the former medical staff. Rumors that Queen de Valois was no longer human spread beyond the castle walls. At the Rue Saint-Martin market, people said that she was already dead, but her body was not decaying and continued to move. Elderly market women whispered that it was not the queen, but a witch who was locked in the palace cellars, and that at night they could hear the flapping of wings, like those of giant bats. Official reports became increasingly rare. The medical records for June 12th state body temperature exceeds 40 degrees. The smell is putrid and metallic. No bowel movements for 8 days. Eyes open but blind. Head cannot be turned. Neck muscles are stiff. The last remark reads, areas of tissue self-destruction have begun on the face. Muscle mass on the right side of the cheek has disappeared. Teeth are visible, remaining unattached. At a meeting of the Privy Council, held behind closed doors, the question of declaring the Queen legally dead was raised. Prince John demanded that the inheritance be secured immediately, and that he be given access to the secret treasury. The King, exhausted and suffering from illness himself, hesitated. His brother Charles proposed a solution. If the body can no longer rule, then the soul is already gone. He referred to the precedent of the mad Princess of Lorraine, who was removed from power due to continuous decay of the body and loss of reason. Meanwhile, according to the few who were allowed to enter her chambers, Françoise herself had lost the ability to respond to speech. She made short, low sounds, like a croak. Sometimes she shuddered at the mention of the word sin, but she did not blink. Her face was a bleeding hollow, and only her upper jaw with its remaining teeth gave her appearance any semblance of humanity. Her neck was swollen, her skin like parchment. To the touch, she was ice cold. On June 2nd, at the insistence of the clergy, a ritual of penitential cleansing was performed. Father Gilles de Rais, who entered the room, stayed there for no more than 3 minutes. In his report, he wrote, "I approached her. She moved. She said nothing. Her face was not a face. I whispered words of forgiveness. A sound escaped from inside. It sounded like no. I ran away." Later, he refused to give the sick woman communion. He accused the court of concealing demonic possession. 2 days later, he was found dead in the river. The official version was that he drowned. The documents were destroyed in a fire in the Troyes archives in the following century. On the third day after the ceremony, Françoise began to have convulsions. Her body arched, her fingers twisted convulsively inward, her nails dug into her palms. The nuns tied her to the bed with leather straps. Her chest rose and fell in jerks. A bone broke off the upper palate, the remnant of a long decayed septum. Blood filled her mouth and flowed down her cheeks like wax from a cracked candle. A medical report dated June 5th stated, "The facial tissues are completely destroyed. Chewing function is absent. There is constant salivation with a putrid odor. The temperature remains at 42 degrees. Necrosis of the soft tissues in the neck and shoulder area has begun. The prognosis is terminal." Closer to midnight that same day, the Queen made her last conscious attempt to speak. Sister Jeanette testified, "I heard ashes, and then a rattle. She gasped for air but did not breathe. I thought it was over, but her heart was still beating. Then she opened her mouth, suddenly, and from there, like an explosion, a piece of flesh burst out, as if from the depths of her mouth. I closed my eyes." Amidst the agony, panic broke out in court circles. The Spanish ambassadors left the castle the next morning. The Duchess of Anjou dismissed her staff and took her jewels with her. Rumors circulated in monastic circles that the Queen's body was no longer capable of dying in the normal way and would rot forever until she was excommunicated from the church. One of the bishops called it a living ulcer on the face of France. The king was forced to order complete silence. Courtiers suspected of spreading rumors were locked in the dungeons of the Louvre. 5 people disappeared without a trace. The body of one of them, the valet Laurent, was later found near the kitchen with a burned cross on his back. On the 6th day of June, when they tried to lift the Queen, her body began to fall apart at the seams. The skin under her armpits cracked, and a dark liquid oozed out of the tears. There was little blood. Only thick plasma remained. The swelling on the back of her head burst, and a stream of pus flowed through her hair. The tissue peeled away like burnt paper. One of the medics committed suicide after the procedure, leaving a note asking to forget the carnal horror. On June 11th, a decision was made. If the Queen did not die before sunrise, she would be given a lethal dose of poison to prevent her from losing her human form completely. But her heart gave out before dawn. At 3:43 a.m., Sister Janet noticed that she had stopped breathing. There was no pulse. Her body temperature dropped. Death had come. The death that everyone had been waiting for. But no one dared to say out loud. The chambers were quiet. Her heart stopped 30 minutes before dawn, but her official death was not recorded until 2 hours later, only after the arrival of the ducal physician and Bishop Fontenay. Only a shell remained on the bed. Everything that had made up the face of Queen Françoise de Valois in life was lost. Her face was melted, her cheeks were destroyed, her jaw was missing. All that remained were uneven remains of bones, a black, burnt-looking tongue, and glassy eyes that had not blinked for the last 9 days. They tried to wash the body, but the skin peeled off at every touch. The nuns responsible for the preparations refused to touch the remains. Then they called in the executioners from Saint-Denis. According to ancient tradition, they prepared the bodies of criminals before burial. According to them, the corpse gave off an unbearable stench, so acrid that it burned the eyes. A document by Louis de Troyes, dated the morning of June 14th, states, "Embalming is impossible. Decay has progressed so far that the internal organs began to decompose while still alive. The liver is a black mass, the heart is fragmented, the lungs are compressed and covered with mucus. The funeral shroud didn't stay in place. Pus oozed from the decomposed pores. The cloth placed over the face quickly became soaked. It was then decided to put an iron mask on the body. The body was displayed for only 2 hours. Ordinary citizens were not allowed to approach the coffin. Ambassadors from Naples and Castile who had come to pay their respects, left the hall in a hurry, covering their noses with handkerchiefs. One of them later said, "What I saw was a sign of God's punishment. France is poisoned by its own flesh." At the same time, secret negotiations were taking place in neighboring halls. Prince Jean demanded immediate confirmation of his position as regent to the old king. He was supported by Marshal de Ville and the bishops of the southern provinces. The Duchess of Anjou declared that Françoise's death proved the illegitimacy of her marriage, and therefore the illegitimacy of her son's inheritance. A struggle for power began. The funeral took place at night. The coffin was filled with resin and surrounded by charcoal to slow down decomposition. The funeral service lasted only 20 minutes. Of the 28 priests who were supposed to attend, only 9 showed up. The rest claimed to be sick. No bells rang for her. A letter written years later by a nun named Janet reads, "I can still hear her wheezing. She wasn't calling us to her, but away from her. She wanted us to leave. She didn't want to be seen. Maybe she didn't want to be alive, or maybe she already wasn't." After her death, the king lived for another 3 months. Rumors filled the city. One version was that Françoise had been poisoned. People pointed to the apothecary Bonnet, who had disappeared shortly before her fall. Another version was that she had fallen victim to a heretical curse placed on her through a ring given to her by a monk. In both cases, the culprits disappeared or were killed. As a result of her death, France plunged into a brief but violent period of turmoil. The struggle for power resulted in coups, executions, and public excommunications. The old clergy was accused of harboring evil spirits, while the new forces were accused of heresy. The people whispered that the queen still roamed the dungeons of the Louvre. Thus ended the life of a woman who had once been crowned in white gold and died alone, gnawing on what little remained of her tongue, the last organ with which she could beg for mercy.